The winter morning of January 28, 1896, dawned cold and misty over the quiet Kentish countryside. In the small village of Paddock Wood, residents went about their daily routines much as they had for centuries. Horse-drawn carts clattered over cobblestones, shopkeepers swept their stoops, and the local constable, P.C. Russell, prepared for what he assumed would be another uneventful day of patrol. He could not have been more wrong. What transpired that day would become a footnote in history that resonates even now, more than a century later. It was the day that Walter Arnold, a motor engineer and car dealer from nearby East Peckham, became the recipient of the world's first recorded speeding ticket. But this story is about far more than one man's find. It's about the collision of two eras, the twilight of horse-drawn transportation and the dawn of the automotive age, and how an absurd chase through the English countryside helped drag British law, kicking and screaming, into the 20th century. Walter Arnold was not your typical Victorian gentleman. While most of his contemporaries were content with traditional horse-drawn carriages, Arnold possessed that peculiar combination of entrepreneurial spirit and technological fascination that marks all true innovators. As a motor engineer and dealer, he had become one of the first people in Britain to recognize the transformative potential of the automobile. In an era when cars were exotic curiosities rather than practical transportation, Arnold had acquired something truly special, a Benz motor car imported from Germany. This wasn't just any vehicle, it was one of Carl Benz's early creations, a mechanical marvel that represented the cutting edge of engineering. In Britain, where such machines were exceedingly rare, Arnold had modified and adapted it, creating what became known as the Arnold-Benz. The vehicle itself was a far cry from what we'd recognize as a car today. It was essentially a motorized carriage with large spoke wheels, an exposed engine, and a top speed that, by modern standards, seems laughably slow. Yet to Victorian eyes, it was nothing short of miraculous. A horseless carriage that moved under its own power, chugging along with mechanical determination. Arnold wasn't just an enthusiast, he was also a businessman. He saw the commercial potential in these new machines and had begun demonstrating them to potential customers throughout Kent. He understood that the automobile represented not merely a novel toy for the wealthy, but the future of transportation itself. To understand why Walter Arnold's January joyride became such a pivotal moment, we must first understand the bizarre legal framework that governed British roads in 1896. A framework so restrictive and outdated that it nearly strangled the British automobile industry in its cradle. The Locomotive Acts, collectively known as the Red Flag Acts, were a series of laws passed in the 1860s to regulate steam-powered vehicles on public roads. The most infamous was the Locomotive Act of 1865, which imposed restrictions that, in retrospect, seem almost comically draconian. The 1865 Act mandated that any locomotive, which technically included early automobiles, even though they hadn't been invented yet, could not exceed 2 miles per hour in towns and 4 miles per hour in the countryside. To put this in perspective, a brisk walking pace is about 3 miles per hour. The law essentially required that motorized vehicles move slower than a pedestrian. But the speed limit was only the beginning. The act also required that each vehicle be operated by a crew of at least 3 people. A driver to steer the vehicle. A stoker or mechanic, originally to tend the engine. A person who had to walk at least 60 yards ahead of the vehicle, carrying a red flag by day or a red lantern by night. That's right. Someone actually had to walk in front of the car waving a flag to warn horses, pedestrians, and other road users of the approaching mechanical beast. This person was also required to assist in controlling any horses that might be frightened by the vehicle's passage. Additionally, the law required vehicles to display the name and address of their owner clearly, and local authorities could impose even stricter regulations if they wished. Why such restrictive laws? The explanation lies in understanding Victorian society and the technology of the time. First, there was genuine safety concern. Early steam traction engines were massive, heavy, loud, and occasionally dangerous. There had been accidents, including instances where these machines damaged roads or frightened horses into causing crashes. In an age where roads were shared spaces, used by pedestrians, children at play, horse-drawn vehicles, and livestock, introducing large, noisy machines seemed genuinely hazardous. Second, there was powerful economic interest at play. The railway companies, which had invested enormous sums in building Britain's rail network, saw road vehicles as potential competition and lobbied vigorously for restrictions. Likewise, traditional coach operators and those invested in horse-related industries had every reason to oppose this new technology. Third, there was simple institutional conservatism. The British establishment, from Parliament to the judiciary, was dominated by landowners and traditional interests who viewed these machines with suspicion and distaste. To them, the existing order, with its horses, carriages, and well-established hierarchies, worked perfectly well. Why change? Finally, there was a genuine technological disconnect. The laws had been written for steam traction engines, massive, heavy machines used primarily for hauling goods or agricultural work. Nobody in 1865 had imagined light, relatively fast automobiles powered by internal combustion engines. When such vehicles began appearing in the 1890s, they were simply categorized under the old locomotive designation, regardless of how ill-fitting that classification had become. These laws had a devastating effect on the British automobile industry before it even began. While inventors and entrepreneurs in France, Germany, and America were rapidly developing and improving motor cars, British innovators found themselves legally hamstrung. Imagine trying to develop a viable automobile when you're legally required to have someone walk ahead of it waving a flag. Imagine trying to sell someone on the convenience and speed of motor transportation when the law forces you to move slower than walking pace. It was absurd, and it was strangling British automotive development. By the mid-1890s, the disconnect between law and reality had become untenable. Automobiles were improving rapidly, becoming lighter, more reliable, and faster. The technology had advanced far beyond the steam traction engines the laws were designed to regulate, but the legal framework remained frozen in the 1860s. Progressive voices began calling for reform. Articles appeared in newspapers and periodicals advocating for the repeal or modification of the Locomotive Acts. Automobile clubs formed to lobby for change. Inventors and entrepreneurs like Walter Arnold chafed under restrictions that seemed designed to prevent progress itself. The stage was set for confrontation. The old order, represented by outdated law and conservative interests, stood opposed to the irresistible force of technological progress. Something had to give, and on January 28, 1896, it did. Picture the scene. Walter Arnold, seated in his Arnold-Benz, is driving through Paddock Wood. The engine putters and coughs, drawing stares from villagers who gather to watch this extraordinary machine pass through their small town. Arnold, perhaps feeling the exhilaration of his mechanical steed or simply running late for a demonstration, increases his speed. 8 miles per hour. By modern standards, barely faster than a jogger. In 1896, in a village where the legal limit was 2 miles per hour, it might as well have been the speed of sound. P.C. Russell, the local constable on duty, watched in horror as this mechanical contraption roared past him at what seemed like a reckless velocity. This was a clear violation of the law, not just any law but multiple provisions of the Locomotive Acts. The constable had a duty to enforce the law, and this flagrant violation could not stand. There was just one problem: the car was getting away. What happened next has become the stuff of legend, a pursuit that sounds more like something from a Buster Keaton film than a serious law enforcement action. P.C. Russell grabbed the nearest available vehicle capable of keeping pace with Arnold's automobile: his bicycle. Mounting his trusty two-wheeler, the constable set off in hot pursuit of the motor car, pedaling furiously through the Kentish countryside. Think about the absurdity of this scene for a moment. A uniformed Victorian police officer, probably with a substantial mustache and serious expression, cycling madly after a motor car driven by a man whose only crime was going 8 miles per hour in a 2-mile-per-hour zone. Any residents who witnessed this chase must have thought they were seeing either the future or sheer madness, or perhaps both. The chase wasn't brief. According to contemporary accounts, P.C. Russell pursued Arnold for approximately 5 miles before finally managing to catch up and flag him down. 5 miles. That's nearly a third of the distance of a modern half-marathon. The constable's legs must have been burning, his lungs heaving as he finally drew alongside the motor car and signaled for Arnold to stop. One can only imagine Arnold's surprise when he realized he was being pursued by the law. He likely saw the chase as ridiculous. He was simply driving his automobile at a perfectly reasonable speed, one that felt quite moderate and safe from behind the wheel. The notion that he was a dangerous criminal seemed absurd. But P.C. Russell was not amused. He had chased this lawbreaker for 5 miles and justice would be served. Walter Arnold was placed under arrest, or at least given a summons to appear in court. The charge: speeding, along with several other violations of the Locomotive Acts. The full list of charges brought against Arnold reveals just how comprehensively he had violated the spirit and letter of the Victorian road laws. Exceeding the speed limit, driving at 8 miles per hour in a 2-mile-per-hour zone, a fourfold violation that must have seemed unconscionable to the authorities. Operating a locomotive on a public road without proper compliance. This was a catch-all charge that essentially meant he was driving a motorized vehicle in a manner that violated the general provisions of the Acts. Failing to employ sufficient attendants, Arnold did not have 3 people operating his vehicle, and he certainly didn't have anyone walking ahead with a red flag. This alone would have been sufficient for prosecution. Failing to display the name and address of the owner, the vehicle apparently lacked clear identification of its owner as required by law. These weren't minor infractions. They represented a comprehensive rejection of the entire regulatory framework governing mechanized road transport. In the eyes of the law, Arnold wasn't just a speeder. He was a scofflaw who had violated multiple provisions designed to keep the public safe. Of course, from Arnold's perspective, and from the perspective of anyone who understood where technology was heading, these laws were nonsensical relics that bore no relationship to the actual operation of modern automobiles. The requirement for a flag bearer was particularly absurd. These small, light motor cars were nothing like the heavy steam traction engines the law had been designed to regulate. But the law was the law, and P.C. Russell had done his duty. Now it was up to the courts to render judgment. When Walter Arnold appeared before the magistrates to answer for his crimes, he entered a courtroom that represented the old order, a place where tradition, precedent, and the letter of the law held sway. The magistrates, probably elderly gentlemen of property and conservative disposition, looked down at this motorcar enthusiast who had so flagrantly violated established regulations. The case itself was straightforward. Arnold had clearly been driving faster than the legal limit. He had clearly failed to comply with the attendant requirements. The other charges were equally cut and dried. There was no real defense available, at least not within the strict confines of the law as written. For the specific offense of speeding, driving at 8 miles per hour in a 2 mile per hour zone, Arnold was fined 1 shilling plus costs. 1 shilling. In modern terms, that's about 5 or 6 pounds in purchasing power, perhaps equivalent to $10 to $15 today. A token amount, really? For all the charges combined, including the various technical violations of the Locomotive Acts, Arnold was ordered to pay a total of £4 7 shillings, plus costs. This was a more substantial sum, perhaps equivalent to £500 to £600 today, or about $750 to $900, but still hardly a crippling penalty for someone of Arnold's means. The lightness of the sentence is telling. Even the magistrates, bound as they were by the law, seemed to recognize that this was not a serious crime. Arnold wasn't a dangerous criminal. He was simply a man with a motor car who had driven at a speed that seemed perfectly reasonable for his vehicle, even if it violated the archaic speed limits still on the books. But the monetary value of the fine misses the real significance of the case. Walter Arnold had become the first person in recorded history to receive a speeding ticket. His name would forever be associated with this dubious distinction, the original traffic offender, the prototype of every person who has ever been pulled over for driving too fast. More importantly, the case highlighted the absurdity of the existing legal framework in a way that abstract arguments never could. Here was a real person, a respectable businessman and engineer, who had been chased for 5 miles by a constable on a bicycle for the heinous crime of driving 8 miles per hour. The image was almost farcical, and it provided powerful ammunition for those arguing that the Locomotive Acts needed to be reformed or repealed. The case became a cause célèbre in automotive and progressive circles. Newspapers covered it, editorials were written, and Arnold himself became something of a folk hero among motoring enthusiasts. He had struck a blow, however inadvertent, against the forces of regulatory conservatism. Walter Arnold's brush with the law didn't happen in isolation. By 1896, pressure had been building for years to reform or repeal the Locomotive Acts. Arnold's case became a focal point in a larger movement that was about to achieve a dramatic victory. Throughout the early 1890s, a loose coalition of inventors, entrepreneurs, engineers, and progressive politicians had been advocating for legal changes that would allow the automobile industry to develop in Britain. They pointed to France and Germany, where less restrictive laws had allowed robust automotive industries to flourish. They argued that Britain was being left behind in a technological revolution of historic importance. Organizations like the Self-Propelled Traffic Association, later the Motor Car Club, formed to lobby Parliament and organize demonstrations of the new technology. They invited MPs and other influential figures to ride in automobiles, showing them that these vehicles were not the dangerous, uncontrollable machines that the old laws assumed them to be. The arguments for reform were compelling. Economic. Britain was falling behind its continental rivals in developing a new industry with enormous commercial potential. If the restrictive laws remained, British manufacturers would be unable to compete, and the country would become dependent on foreign imports. Technological. The laws were written for steam traction engines, not the lighter, more nimble automobiles now being developed. Applying 1860s regulations to 1890s technology made no sense. Practical. The requirement for a flag bearer and the absurdly low speed limits made automobiles essentially useless for their intended purpose, transportation. If motor cars were to have any practical application, they needed to be allowed to travel at reasonable speeds. Social. Automobiles had the potential to transform society, making travel faster, easier, and more accessible. Preventing this transformation through outdated law was holding back progress itself. Of course, not everyone was convinced. The reform movement faced significant opposition from various quarters. Traditionalists argued that the existing system worked fine and that there was no compelling need to change it. Why risk disrupting the established order for a technology that might prove to be a fad? Safety advocates worried genuinely about the dangers posed by faster vehicles on roads designed for horse traffic. What would happen when automobiles traveling at 12 or even 15 miles per hour shared narrow country lanes with pedestrians and animals? Railway interests saw motor cars as potential competition and used their considerable political influence to oppose liberalization of the road laws. Horse-related industries, from horse breeders to feed suppliers to traditional coach operators, had obvious economic reasons to resist the new technology. The debate played out in Parliament, in newspapers, and in public forums throughout 1895 and early 1896. Both sides marshaled arguments, held demonstrations, and lobbied furiously. The outcome was far from certain. Walter Arnold received his fine in January 1896. By November of the same year, Parliament had passed the Locomotives on Highways Act 1896, a revolutionary piece of legislation that fundamentally transformed the legal landscape for motor vehicles in Britain. The new act made several crucial modifications to the regulatory framework. Speed limits. The national speed limit for light locomotives, which included automobiles weighing less than 3 tons, was raised to 14 miles per hour. Local authorities could set lower limits in their jurisdictions, but the nationwide standard was nearly 10 times higher than the previous 2 miles per hour in towns. This was genuinely revolutionary. It allowed motor cars to function as practical transportation rather than slow-moving curiosities. Crew requirements. The requirement for 3 attendants was abolished. Automobiles could now be operated by a single driver. More importantly, the absurd requirement for someone to walk ahead with a red flag was eliminated entirely. Registration. The Act introduced a new system of vehicle registration, requiring owners to register their vehicles with local authorities. This created a formal framework for identifying and tracking motor vehicles, replacing the previous ad hoc requirement to display owner information. Licensing. While the Act didn't immediately require driver licensing, that would come later, it laid the groundwork for more sophisticated regulation of who could operate motor vehicles. Weight classifications. The Act created different categories of vehicles based on weight, with different rules applying to each. This recognized that a light motor car and a heavy traction engine were fundamentally different machines requiring different regulatory approaches. Several factors came together in 1896 to make reform possible. Technological maturity. By 1896, automobiles had progressed to the point where they were reliable enough for practical use. The technology was no longer experimental, it was ready for commercialization. International competition. France in particular had become the center of the automotive world, with a thriving industry that was leaving Britain behind. National pride and economic self-interest demanded a response. Public demonstrations. Organizations like the Self-Propelled Traffic Association had successfully shown that motor cars could be operated safely at higher speeds. The concrete evidence of safe operation helped overcome abstract fears. High-profile cases. Walter Arnold's prosecution was not the only one, but it was perhaps the most famous. Such cases provided concrete examples of how absurd the old laws had become. Political momentum. Progressive politicians and reform-minded civil servants had built sufficient support within government to push the legislation through. Key figures like Harry Lawson, a cycling and automobile entrepreneur, used their influence and connections to advance the cause. Economic arguments. The potential economic benefits of a domestic automobile industry became impossible to ignore. Britain risked being shut out of an emerging global market if it didn't act. The confluence of these factors created a political environment where reform became not just possible but necessary. The Locomotives on Highways Act 1896 represented Parliament's acknowledgement that the old order was unsustainable and that Britain needed to embrace the automotive age. To celebrate the new law, which came into effect on November 14, 1896, the recently formed Motor Car Club organized what became known as the Emancipation Run, a drive from London to Brighton designed to celebrate the liberation of British motorists from the tyranny of the Red Flag Acts. On that November morning, dozens of motor cars assembled in London for the run to Brighton, a distance of about 60 miles. The participants included many of the pioneers of British motoring, driving vehicles from various manufacturers, British, French, and German. The symbolism was powerful and deliberate. As the procession set off, the organizers made a show of tearing up a red flag, the hated symbol of the old regime. It was a declaration that a new era had begun, that the automobile would no longer be shackled by outdated regulations designed for a different technology and a different time. The run wasn't without its challenges. Many of the vehicles broke down along the route. Automotive technology was still in its infancy after all. But enough cars completed the journey to demonstrate that motor cars were viable for long-distance travel. More importantly, the event generated enormous publicity for the automotive cause and marked a psychological turning point for British motoring. The Emancipation Run established a tradition that continues to this day. Every year, vintage car enthusiasts recreate the London to Brighton Run, celebrating that moment in 1896 when British motorists gained their freedom. It remains one of the most famous vintage car events in the world, a living link to the early days of motoring. The effects of the new law were felt immediately. British entrepreneurs began establishing automobile manufacturing companies. Importers brought in more vehicles from the continent. The first automobile shows and exhibitions were organized. A domestic market for motor cars began to develop. Speed limits were still quite restrictive by modern standards. 14 miles per hour is walking pace by today's expectations. But they were reasonable enough to allow automobiles to function as practical transportation. Drivers could actually travel faster than pedestrians, which seems like a minimal requirement but was revolutionary compared to the previous regime. The roads themselves began to change. With more motor traffic, there was pressure to improve road surfaces, which had been allowed to deteriorate during the railway age when road transport had declined in importance. Signage began to appear. The first traffic management systems were considered. An entire ecosystem began to develop around the automobile: repair shops, parts suppliers, driving schools, automobile clubs, and specialist publications. Britain was finally joining the automotive age, albeit several years later than its continental rivals. So what became of Walter Arnold, the man who had inadvertently helped spark this revolution? Arnold continued his work as a motor engineer and dealer, becoming one of the early figures in the British automobile industry. His Arnold Motor Carriage Company, based in East Peckham, produced some of Britain's first domestically manufactured automobiles. These were still largely based on Benz designs, hence the Arnold-Benz designation, but they represented a British presence in the emerging industry. Arnold's company faced the same challenges as all early automotive manufacturers. The technology was unreliable, the market was small, manufacturing was expensive, and established competitors from France and Germany were already well ahead. Despite these obstacles, Arnold persisted, contributing to the gradual development of British automotive manufacturing capabilities. As for his famous speeding ticket, Arnold seems to have worn it as something of a badge of honor. He understood that his prosecution had helped highlight the absurdity of the old laws and had contributed, in a small way, to their reform. In the tight-knit community of early British motorists, he was known as the man who had received the first speeding ticket, a claim to fame that, while dubious, nevertheless marked him as a pioneer. Of course, Arnold's ticket was only the first of billions that would be issued over the next century and more. As automobiles became faster and more common, speeding became an endemic problem. The 14 miles per hour limit of 1896 would soon seem as quaint and outdated as the 2 miles per hour limit it replaced. By 1903, just 7 years after the Emancipation Run, the speed limit had been raised again to 20 miles per hour. It would continue to evolve as roads improved and vehicles became more capable. The entire apparatus of speed enforcement, traffic police, speed cameras, radar guns, and all the rest, would develop into a massive global industry of its own. Every person who has ever received a speeding ticket owes a distant debt to Walter Arnold. He was the original, the prototype, the first person to experience that sinking feeling when you see the flashing lights in your rearview mirror and realize you've been caught. The tale of Walter Arnold and his 8-mile-per-hour joyride might seem like a quaint historical anecdote, but it actually illuminates several important themes that remain relevant today. Arnold's case perfectly illustrates the challenge of regulating new technology. Laws are reactive, not proactive. They respond to existing conditions rather than anticipating future developments. When a genuinely novel technology emerges, it often finds itself governed by laws designed for something else entirely. The Locomotive Acts were written for steam traction engines, not automobiles. They made some sense in that original context but became absurd when applied to a technology their authors had never imagined. This pattern has repeated throughout history. Telegraph law applied to telephones, telephone law applied to the internet, broadcast law applied to streaming media. We face similar challenges today. How should autonomous vehicles be regulated? What rules should govern drone use? How do we apply privacy laws written for the analog age to digital technology? Arnold's story reminds us that these questions are not new. Every generation must grapple with the lag between technological change and legal adaptation. The opposition to automotive development in Victorian Britain shows how institutional inertia can resist even beneficial change. The railway companies, traditional transport industries, and conservative politicians all had reasons to oppose the automobile, and they used the existing legal framework to slow its development. Similar dynamics play out today whenever a new technology threatens established interests. Taxi companies resisting ride-sharing services, traditional hotels fighting short-term rentals, broadcast media opposing streaming platforms. The specifics change, but the pattern remains. Incumbent industries use regulation as a weapon against upstart competitors, often disguising economic self-interest as concern for safety or tradition. Arnold's story shows that such resistance, while it can delay change, ultimately proves futile. The automobile was too useful, too transformative, to be held back indefinitely. Good technology finds a way, even through a thicket of restrictive regulation. Perhaps most striking is how quickly everything changed. In January 1896, Arnold was prosecuted for driving 8 miles per hour. By November of the same year, the law had been completely reformed. Within a decade, automobiles had gone from exotic curiosities to an established part of British life. This reminds us that major social transformations can happen faster than we expect. The Victorian world seems so stable, so fixed in its traditions, yet it was swept away with remarkable speed. The motor car was only one part of that transformation, but it was a significant one. It changed not just how people traveled but how they lived, worked, and thought about space and time. We are living through similarly rapid changes today. The smartphone is barely 15 years old, yet it has transformed society. Social media, barely older, has reshaped politics and culture. Artificial intelligence is developing at a pace that would have seemed fantastical even a decade ago. Arnold's story reminds us that the rapid pace of change is not new. Every age has experienced its own technological revolutions. Finally, there's something compelling about how one man's ordinary decision, to drive his car at what seemed like a reasonable speed, became part of a larger historical narrative. Arnold didn't set out to make history. He didn't plan to become the first person to receive a speeding ticket. He was just going about his business, demonstrating his product, when he ran afoul of laws that seemed increasingly divorced from reality. Yet his action, combined with those of countless others pushing against the constraints of the old system, helped create momentum for change. No single person reformed the Locomotive Acts. It took inventors, entrepreneurs, lobbyists, progressive politicians, and yes, even lawbreakers like Arnold to make it happen. This is how social change often works. It's not usually the product of great leaders or dramatic moments, though those play a role, but rather the accumulation of countless small acts by ordinary people living their lives, pushing boundaries, and refusing to accept that the current system is the only possible one. It's worth taking a moment to consider just how far we've come from that January day in 1896. Walter Arnold's 8 miles per hour, the speed that seemed so dangerously reckless to P.C. Russell, is now slower than the pace of a typical urban cyclist. Modern cars can exceed 200 miles per hour. The fastest production vehicles approached 300 miles per hour. The roads have changed beyond recognition. The narrow country lanes of Victorian England have been joined by massive motorways, urban expressways, and sophisticated traffic management systems. Billions of vehicles travel trillions of miles each year. The automobile has reshaped cities, enabled suburbs, transformed commerce, and altered human relationships with distance and time. Of course, these changes have brought new problems. Traffic congestion, air pollution, road deaths, urban sprawl, and climate change are all, to varying degrees, products of the automotive age. The motor car, which seemed like such an unalloyed benefit in 1896, has proven to be a mixed blessing at best. And now we stand on the brink of another transformation. Electric vehicles are rapidly replacing internal combustion engines. Autonomous vehicles promise to change our relationship with driving entirely. The very concept of personal car ownership is being challenged by ride-sharing and car-sharing services. We may be approaching the end of the automobile era as we've known it. When historians a century from now look back on our time, they may see it as transitional, just as we now see 1896 as the twilight of the horse age and the dawn of the motor age. They may tell stories of the last generation to drive their own cars, much as we tell stories of the last generation to drive horses. But they will still, I suspect, remember Walter Arnold. His story has a simplicity and charm that gives it staying power. The image of that Victorian constable pedaling madly after a motor car, the absurdity of a 1 shilling fine for going 8 miles per hour, the symbolic tearing of the red flag. These are the details that make history human and memorable. On quiet days in Paddock Wood, you can still walk the streets that Walter Arnold drove down that January morning. The village has changed, of course. There are paved roads now, traffic signals, and more houses. But the essential character of the place remains recognizable. If you stand on those streets and imagine that scene, Arnold and his Arnold-Benz puttering along at 8 miles per hour, followed by a furiously pedaling constable, it's hard not to smile. There's something fundamentally absurd about the whole situation, something that captures the awkward collision between old and new. But there's also something profound in it. That moment in Paddock Wood was a hinge of history, one of those small but significant events that marked the transition between eras. Before that chase, the automobile in Britain was a curiosity, hobbled by ridiculous laws. After it, change became inevitable. Arnold's prosecution helped catalyze reform that unleashed an industrial revolution. The story reminds us that progress is not smooth or automatic. It requires people willing to push boundaries even at personal cost. It requires recognizing when laws have become divorced from reality and having the courage to change them. It requires seeing beyond the present moment to imagine how things could be different. Most of all, it reminds us that the future arrives in unexpected ways. Nobody in that Paddock Wood courtroom could have imagined the world of automobility that would emerge from their 8-mile-per-hour controversy. They were arguing about speed limits and flag bearers, not foreseeing a future of motorways and traffic jams, of drive-through restaurants and road trips, of parking garages and traffic police. We are equally blind to the implications of today's changes. The technologies we're developing now, artificial intelligence, biotechnology, quantum computing, will transform the world in ways we can't predict. Future generations will look back on our debates and regulations with the same mixture of amusement and bemusement that we feel when reading about Victorian speed limits. But if Walter Arnold's story teaches us anything, it's that we shouldn't let fear of the unknown or attachment to the familiar prevent us from embracing beneficial change. The automobile was genuinely transformative, despite all its problems and unintended consequences. The technology was real, the benefits were real, and the old laws that tried to prevent its development were ultimately ineffective and counterproductive. The same will be true of whatever comes next. Our task is not to prevent change, that's impossible, but to shape it thoughtfully, to maximize its benefits while mitigating its harms, and to update our laws and institutions quickly enough that they don't become obstacles to progress. And maybe, just maybe, we should approach these challenges with a bit of humility and humor. After all, someday our earnest debates about current regulations might seem as quaint and absurd as a policeman chasing a car on a bicycle. Someday people might laugh at our speed limits, our traffic laws, our entire framework for thinking about transportation and technology. But they will tell our stories just as we tell Walter Arnold's. And in those stories, future generations will find the same themes: the inevitable advance of technology, the resistance of established interests, the courage of pioneers, and the eventual triumph of common sense over outdated regulation. Walter Arnold, motor engineer and dealer from East Peckham, Kent, received his 1 shilling fine and paid it without much complaint. He continued his work, helping to build Britain's automotive industry. He lived to see the automobile transform from exotic curiosity to everyday necessity. And he earned himself a place in history, not as a great inventor or visionary leader, but as the answer to a trivia question: who received the world's first speeding ticket? It's a modest form of immortality, but immortality nonetheless. And in the story behind that fact lies a rich tale of technological change, legal reform, and the messy, complicated process by which human society adapts to new realities. On that January morning in 1896, when Walter Arnold pushed his Arnold-Benz up to 8 miles per hour and P.C. Russell grabbed his bicycle for pursuit, neither man knew they were making history. They were just doing their jobs. One demonstrating his product, the other enforcing the law. But history has a way of finding significance in unexpected places. From that 8-mile-per-hour chase through the Kentish countryside came a story that still resonates today, a reminder that the future arrives whether we're ready for it or not, and that sometimes the best thing we can do is get out of its way. Or, failing that, at least try to keep up, even if we have to do it on a bicycle. History remembers Walter Arnold, but what of P.C. Russell, the bicycle-riding constable who pursued him? While Arnold became a footnote in automotive history, Russell returned to relative obscurity, his name preserved only in a few contemporary accounts of the incident. Yet Russell's role in this drama deserves consideration. He was not a villain or a fool, despite how easy it is to mock his bicycle chase from our modern vantage point. He was a working police officer doing his job in accordance with the law as it existed. When he saw Arnold speeding through Paddock Wood at 4 times the legal limit, he had a duty to act. Imagine Russell's perspective that morning. He's a professional law enforcement officer in a small village where serious crime is rare. Most of his work involves mediating disputes, dealing with public drunkenness, and ensuring general order. Then this mechanical contraption comes roaring through his village at what seems like a terrifying speed. People are staring, perhaps alarmed. The noise of the engine is disturbing the peace. The law is clear. This vehicle is breaking multiple regulations. As an officer of the law, Russell cannot simply ignore this flagrant violation. His authority, his professional reputation, and his duty all demand action. So he does what he must, he gives chase. The fact that he had to pursue Arnold on a bicycle for 5 miles speaks to Russell's dedication and physical fitness. This wasn't a comfortable jaunt, it was a grueling pursuit over rough Victorian roads, probably uphill at points, maintaining a pace above 8 miles per hour for an extended period. Russell must have been exhausted when he finally caught up with Arnold. When he made the arrest or issued the summons, Russell probably felt he was doing important work. He had caught a lawbreaker, someone who was endangering public safety and thumbing his nose at established regulations. The fact that Arnold was a respectable businessman probably made the offense more galling. People of Arnold's class were supposed to set an example, not flagrantly violate the law. Russell likely had no idea that this arrest would become famous, that it would be remembered long after every other arrest he made in his career was forgotten. He certainly couldn't have known that history would remember him as a somewhat comical figure, the man who chased a car on a bicycle. One wonders what Russell thought in later years when the locomotive acts were reformed and motor cars became common. Did he feel vindicated, believing that his enforcement of the old laws had been correct, even if those laws were subsequently changed? Or did he come to see the incident as Arnold probably saw it, as an absurd artifact of a transitional moment when new technology collided with old regulation? We'll never know. Russell left no memoir, gave no interviews about his famous pursuit. He performed his duty, testified in court, and returned to his regular work. But his dedication to law enforcement, misguided though it may seem in retrospect, was part of the story. Without his pursuit and Arnold's prosecution, the case might never have achieved the symbolic importance it came to hold. The magistrates who heard Arnold's case faced a genuine dilemma that's easy to overlook. On one hand, the law was absolutely clear. Arnold had violated multiple provisions of the Locomotive Acts. The evidence was incontrovertible, there was no question of guilt. On the other hand, these were educated men who likely understood that the law they were enforcing was increasingly anachronistic. They probably knew that reform was being debated in Parliament. Some of them may have even ridden in motor cars themselves or at least seen demonstrations of the new technology. The relatively light sentence they imposed suggests their ambivalence. A 1 shilling fine for the speeding offense itself was essentially nominal. It was the minimum punishment that would satisfy the letter of the law without imposing any real hardship on the defendant. The additional penalties for the other violations brought the total to a more substantial sum, but still nothing that would bankrupt or even seriously inconvenience a man of Arnold's means. The court was in effect saying, yes, technically you broke the law and we must impose some penalty for that. But we're not going to treat you as a serious criminal because we all know these laws don't really make sense anymore. This kind of judicial pragmatism, enforcing the letter of the law while recognizing its spirit has become outdated, is actually quite common during periods of rapid social or technological change. Courts find themselves enforcing laws that no longer align with contemporary understanding or values, and they often respond by imposing minimal sentences or finding creative ways to mitigate the harshness of outdated statutes. The Arnold case is an excellent example. The magistrates did their duty by finding him guilty and imposing a fine, but they kept that fine small enough that it served more as a symbolic rebuke than a genuine punishment. In doing so, they acknowledged both the law as written and the reality that it needed changing. To fully appreciate Arnold's story, it helps to understand what his vehicle was actually like. The Arnold-Benz that caused such consternation in Paddock Wood was a far cry from anything we'd recognize as a car today. Based on Carl Benz's early designs, particularly the Benz Velo, the Arnold-Benz was an open vehicle that looked more like a motorized carriage than a modern automobile. It had the engine, a single-cylinder internal combustion engine producing perhaps 1.5 to 3 horsepower. To put that in perspective, a modern lawnmower engine produces more power. The engine was mounted in the rear of the vehicle and connected to the wheels through a primitive transmission system involving belts and chains. The frame, a light chassis made of steel tubing, designed to be as light as possible since the engine produced so little power. The entire vehicle probably weighed less than 500 pounds. The wheels, large wooden or early pneumatic-tired wheels, similar to bicycle wheels but heavier. These provided minimal suspension. Passengers felt every bump and rut in the road. The controls, steering was accomplished through a tiller like a boat, rather than a wheel. Speed was controlled through a primitive throttle and ignition timing system. Braking was rudimentary at best, often just a block that pressed against the wheel or a band brake on the transmission. The advertised top speed was perhaps 12 to 14 miles per hour on level ground in good conditions. In practice, hills, rough roads, or headwinds could slow it considerably. Arnold's 8 miles per hour through Paddock Wood was probably close to the vehicle's normal cruising speed. The reliability, this is crucial to understand. Early motor cars were notoriously unreliable. Breakdowns were expected, not exceptional. Drivers needed to be mechanically skilled because they would certainly need to make repairs on the road. The Arnold-Benz was advanced for its time, but it was still a primitive machine prone to all sorts of failures. The experience, riding in an Arnold-Benz, was nothing like driving a modern car. It was noisy, the engine coughed and clattered constantly. It was smelly, burning oil and fuel produced noxious fumes. It was uncomfortable, the minimal suspension meant every bump rattled your bones. It was cold and wet, there was no weather protection. And it was uncertain. You never knew if you'd reach your destination or end up pushing the vehicle back home. Yet despite all these limitations, the Arnold-Benz represented something revolutionary. It was self-propelled. It didn't need a horse. It could travel at a consistent speed regardless of terrain within limits. It didn't need to be fed or stabled. It was a machine that promised freedom and efficiency, even if the promise was more potential than reality in 1896. Understanding what the vehicle was actually like helps us appreciate both sides of the Arnold controversy. From Arnold's perspective, 8 miles per hour was a perfectly reasonable, even cautious speed for this vehicle. It wasn't being pushed to its limits, it was traveling at a moderate, controllable pace. The idea that this was speeding in any dangerous sense must have seemed absurd. From the authorities' perspective, however, this clattering, smoking, mechanical beast roaring through their village at 4 times the legal limit was genuinely alarming. It made noise. It startled horses. It represented a technology they didn't fully understand. Their restrictive approach, while ultimately counterproductive, came from a real place of concern about public safety and social order. To modern readers, the fuss over speed limits might seem like much ado about nothing. Who cares whether Arnold was going 8 miles per hour or 2? But in the economic context of Victorian Britain, these regulations had serious implications. The railway monopoly. By the 1890s, Britain's railways had achieved near total dominance of long-distance transportation. Massive capital had been invested in the rail network, creating powerful economic interests that wanted to prevent competition. Road transportation had declined dramatically since the railway age began. Many roads had fallen into disrepair because they saw little use except for local travel. The railway companies saw motor cars as a potential threat. If automobiles could travel at reasonable speeds, they might compete with branch railway lines for short and medium-distance traffic. The companies therefore had every incentive to support restrictive speed limits and other regulations that would keep motor cars slow and impractical. This wasn't paranoid thinking. In the early 20th century, motor cars and buses did indeed begin taking traffic from railways, particularly on shorter routes. The railway companies' fears were prescient, but their response, trying to use regulation to strangle a competitor in its cradle, proved futile. The horse economy. Victorian Britain had a massive economic infrastructure built around horses. Consider everything involved in the horse-powered transportation system. Horse breeding and training. Feed production and distribution. Stables and livery services. Harness and tack manufacturing. Veterinary services. Coach and carriage manufacturing. Professional drivers and grooms. Manure collection and distribution. Blacksmiths and farriers. Thousands of businesses and hundreds of thousands of jobs depended on the horse economy. The prospect of motor cars replacing horses threatened all of these interests. While creative destruction is economically beneficial in the long run, it creates real losers in the short term. People whose skills become obsolete, whose businesses fail, whose investments lose value. These interests had political power, and they used it to support restrictive regulation of motor cars. The speed limits weren't just about safety, they were about economic protectionism. Keep motor cars slow and impractical, and people would continue to depend on horses. Class and status. There was also a class dimension to the motor car debate. Early automobiles were expensive and could only be afforded by the wealthy. To working-class and middle-class Britons, motor cars seemed like toys for the rich, frivolous luxuries that shouldn't be allowed to inconvenience ordinary people. The sight of wealthy motorists zooming through villages in their expensive machines while ordinary people struggled to make ends meet generated genuine resentment. Restrictive speed limits could be framed as protecting common people from the recklessness of privileged elites. This class resentment persisted even after motor cars became more common. Early traffic regulations often reflected a tension between the desires of motorists, disproportionately wealthy, and the concerns of non-motorists, disproportionately working class. Speed limits, licensing requirements, and traffic enforcement all became battlegrounds in broader class conflicts. Understanding these economic dimensions helps explain why a seemingly simple issue like speed limits generated such fierce debate. It wasn't really about whether 8 miles per hour was dangerous. It was about much larger questions. What would be the economic and social impact of the automobile? Who would benefit and who would lose? Should new technology be allowed to disrupt existing industries and ways of life? These questions remain relevant today. When we debate regulations for ride-sharing services, electric vehicles, or autonomous cars, we're having the same fundamental argument that Victorians had about the Arnold-Benz. How should society manage technological change? How do we balance innovation against established interests? How do we protect people from genuine harm while avoiding overregulation that stifles beneficial development? One crucial aspect of the Arnold story is that Britain was already falling behind its continental rivals by 1896. While British inventors and entrepreneurs chafed under the Locomotive Acts, French and German manufacturers were rapidly developing the automobile industry. France, the early leader. France had emerged as the world center of automotive manufacturing by the mid-1890s. Companies like Peugeot, Panhard Levasseur, and de Dion Boughton were producing cars in meaningful numbers. French engineers were innovating rapidly, developing better engines, transmissions, and chassis designs. Why France? Partly because French regulations were much less restrictive than Britain's. French authorities had taken a more permissive approach to motor vehicles, allowing them to develop without the crippling restrictions that hobbled British development. This regulatory environment, combined with strong engineering traditions and wealthy customers, allowed France to dominate the early automotive industry. By 1896, France had hundreds of motor cars on its roads. Regular motor races were being held, driving both sporting interest and technical development. A whole ecosystem of manufacturers, suppliers, and specialists had emerged. France was where you went if you wanted to see the cutting edge of automotive technology. Germany, engineering excellence. Germany, home to Karl Benz and Gottlieb Daimler, was also advancing rapidly. While German production numbers weren't yet matching France's, German engineering was superb. The Benz vehicles that Arnold imported and modified were among the most reliable and well-designed cars of the era. German manufacturers benefited from strong engineering traditions, good technical education, and supportive regulations. The German states, Germany wasn't yet fully unified culturally, despite political unification in 1871, generally took a pragmatic approach to motor cars, recognizing their potential rather than fearing their impact. America, the coming giant. In America, automotive development was also proceeding more quickly than in Britain, though the United States wouldn't achieve dominance until the early 20th century. American inventors like Charles Duryea and Henry Ford were experimenting with motor cars, unencumbered by restrictive regulations. America's advantage would ultimately come from its combination of engineering skill, manufacturing efficiency, and huge domestic market. But in 1896, American automotive development was still in its early stages, roughly comparable to Britain's. Britain, shackled potential. Britain had excellent engineers, wealthy potential customers, and strong manufacturing traditions. There was no technical reason Britain couldn't have led the automotive revolution. British inventors had pioneered steam power, railways, and numerous other technologies. But the Locomotive Acts created an artificial disadvantage. British inventors couldn't develop and test vehicles under realistic conditions. British manufacturers couldn't build a domestic market because motor cars were essentially illegal for practical use. British capital flowed to other investments because the legal environment made automotive ventures too risky. The result was that Britain missed the first phase of the automotive revolution. When the Locomotives on Highways Act finally passed in 1896, British manufacturers were years behind their French and German competitors. Britain would eventually develop a significant automotive industry, but it never achieved the dominance it might have if it had moved earlier. This represented a real economic cost. Automotive manufacturing became one of the major industries of the 20th century, employing millions and generating enormous wealth. Britain's share of this industry was smaller than it might have been, largely because of regulatory choices made in the 1860s and maintained until 1896. Walter Arnold's case helped catalyze the reform that allowed Britain to begin catching up, but the lost years couldn't be fully recovered. The international dimension of the story reminds us that regulatory choices have competitive consequences. Nations that over-regulate emerging technologies may find themselves left behind by more permissive rivals. From our modern perspective, the Victorian fear of motor cars seems ridiculous. How could a vehicle traveling at 8 miles per hour be dangerous? But it's worth seriously examining whether the safety concerns that motivated the Locomotive Acts had any validity. The roads, Victorian roads, were not designed for motor traffic. They were narrow, often unpaved or poorly paved, and shared by pedestrians, horses, carts, and livestock. There were no sidewalks in many areas. People walked in the street. Children played there. Animals wandered freely. In this environment, a motor car was genuinely disruptive. The noise could startle horses, potentially causing them to bolt and injure their riders or damage their vehicles. The speed, even at only 8 miles per hour, was faster than most road users expected. The lack of familiarity meant that people didn't know how to react to these new machines. The vehicles, early motor cars, were also genuinely less safe than modern vehicles. They had poor brakes that required significant distance to stop. Primitive or non-existent lighting for night driving. No safety features, no seatbelts, airbags, crumple zones, or any of the passive safety systems we take for granted. Unreliable steering and handling. A tendency to break down in unpredictable ways, sometimes leaving the vehicle stopped in dangerous locations. A motor car that broke down in the middle of a narrow road could create a hazard for other road users. A motor car with poor brakes might not be able to stop if a child ran into the street. These weren't entirely unreasonable concerns. The drivers, early motorists, also had no training or licensing requirements. Anyone who could afford a motor car could drive one, regardless of skill or judgment. There were no traffic laws in the modern sense, no consensus about right-of-way or proper road behavior. Every driver was essentially making it up as they went along. This situation genuinely created risks. Some early motorists were reckless, treating their vehicles as toys and showing little regard for other road users. While most were probably cautious, the limitations of the vehicles and the novelty of the experience encouraged care. There were certainly some who behaved dangerously. The accident record. What actually happened when motor cars became more common? Did the dire predictions of safety advocates come true? The answer is complicated. There were certainly accidents, some serious or fatal. Early automotive safety records are incomplete, but we know that motor cars did kill people, pedestrians, other motorists, and the drivers themselves. As speeds increased and cars became more common, fatalities increased as well. However, the accident rate didn't prove catastrophic in the way some had feared. Motor cars weren't mowing down pedestrians wholesale. With reasonable regulation, speed limits appropriate to conditions, basic traffic rules, eventually licensing and vehicle standards, motor cars could be integrated into the transportation system with manageable risk. The Victorian overreaction, requiring someone to walk ahead with a flag limiting speeds to below walking pace, was not justified by the actual risk profile. More moderate regulations, like those enacted in 1896, provided a better balance between safety and utility. This pattern has repeated with many new technologies. Initial fears often prove exaggerated, but some degree of regulation is usually necessary to manage genuine risks. The challenge is calibrating the regulatory response appropriately, enough to address real dangers, but not so much that the technology's benefits are lost. Modern parallels. We face similar debates today with autonomous vehicles, electric scooters, drones, and other emerging transportation technologies. How safe is safe enough? What regulations are appropriate? How do we protect the public without stifling innovation? The Arnold story suggests that erring too far on the side of caution, imposing crippling restrictions because of theoretical rather than demonstrated risks, can be counterproductive. But it also reminds us that genuine safety concerns deserve serious attention, even for promising new technologies. The Arnold case didn't happen in a vacuum. It played out against a backdrop of changing public opinion and vigorous media coverage of the motor car debate. The press. Victorian Britain had a vibrant newspaper and periodical press, with publications catering to every interest and ideology. Some papers enthusiastically promoted motor cars as symbols of progress and modernity. Others viewed them with suspicion or outright hostility, seeing them as dangerous toys for the wealthy that threatened traditional ways of life. The Arnold case received coverage in both local and national press. Some accounts treated it sympathetically, portraying Arnold as a victim of outdated laws and the bicycle chase as farcical. Others took a more censorious view, suggesting that motorists like Arnold needed to be brought under control before they caused serious harm. Specialist publications. By 1896, specialist automotive publications were beginning to appear, catering to the small but growing community of motor enthusiasts. These publications naturally covered the Arnold case extensively, using it as ammunition in their campaign for legal reform. Articles appeared analyzing the absurdity of the existing laws, interviewing Arnold and other motorists, and building public pressure for change. The automotive press was small but influential, reaching exactly the audience: wealthy, well-connected individuals with an interest in new technology, who had political influence. Public demonstrations. The Self-Propelled Traffic Association and similar groups organized public demonstrations of motor cars, inviting politicians, journalists, and influential citizens to ride in them. These events were designed to demystify the technology and show that motor cars could be operated safely at speeds well above the legal limit. Such demonstrations were crucial in shifting public opinion. It's one thing to read about motor cars in a newspaper. It's quite another to actually ride in one and experience the speed, control, and potential of the technology firsthand. Many skeptics became converts after a personal experience with the new machines. The cartoonists. Political cartoons of the era captured the motor car debate with humor and insight. Cartoonists depicted absurd scenarios of flag bearers running frantically ahead of cars, police chasing motorists on bicycles, and pompous officials enforcing ridiculous regulations. These cartoons played a role in shaping public opinion, making the existing laws seem foolish and outdated. Humor can be a powerful tool for social change. Once something becomes a joke, it's hard to defend seriously. The shifting consensus. By 1896, public opinion was clearly moving in favor of motor cars and against the old restrictions. While there remained skeptics and opponents, the emerging consensus among educated, urban, and progressive Britons was that the Locomotive Acts needed reform. This shift in public opinion made political action possible. Politicians are generally reluctant to act without public support, especially on controversial issues. The fact that reform was popular, or at least acceptable, to a significant portion of the public gave Parliament the political cover it needed to act. The Arnold case contributed to this shifting consensus. It provided a concrete, memorable example of how the old laws had become disconnected from reality. It gave reformers a story they could tell, a human face they could put on the abstract arguments for change. Walter Arnold's speeding ticket occurred during what historians sometimes call the long 19th century, the period from the French Revolution, 1789, to World War I, 1914, characterized by rapid industrialization, technological change, and social transformation. By 1896, Britain had already experienced multiple waves of technological disruption. The Industrial Revolution, the transformation from agrarian to industrial economy, had displaced millions from traditional rural livelihoods, created new urban centers, and fundamentally altered the social structure. The Railway Age. Railways had revolutionized transportation and communication, shrinking distances and transforming commerce. They had also destroyed traditional coaching businesses and canal transport, creating winners and losers on a massive scale. The telegraph. Instantaneous long-distance communication had changed business, journalism, and diplomacy. Information that once took weeks to travel now moved at the speed of electricity. Steamships. Ocean transport had been revolutionized, making international trade and migration cheaper and faster than ever before. Each of these transformations had generated resistance, controversy, and social disruption. Each had also brought enormous benefits that, in retrospect, made the disruption seem worthwhile. The Victorian era was characterized by a fundamental tension between enthusiasm for progress and anxiety about its social costs. The motor car represented yet another wave of disruption. Victorian Britons had experience with technological change, they'd lived through it repeatedly, but that experience didn't make it easier. If anything, it made some people more wary. How much change could society absorb? At what point did the pace of transformation become destabilizing? The Locomotive Acts can be understood partly as a conservative reaction against relentless change. By severely restricting motor cars, Parliament was essentially saying, "We've had enough disruption for now. Let's preserve what we have rather than rushing headlong into yet another transformation." This conservative impulse was understandable, even if it ultimately proved futile. Change cannot be stopped by legislation, only delayed or redirected. The motor car was coming whether Parliament liked it or not. The only question was whether Britain would be at the forefront of this change or would lag behind, held back by outdated regulations. It's worth considering how contingent Arnold's historical significance was. If P.C. Russell had been patrolling a different area that day, if Arnold had driven through Paddock Wood an hour earlier or later, if the weather had been worse and Arnold had driven more slowly, any of these small changes might have meant that someone else received the first speeding ticket, or that the famous chase never happened. Arnold didn't plan to make history. He was just going about his business when chance and circumstance conspired to give him a starring role in a larger drama. This reminds us that history often turns on small, unpredictable events. Similarly, the timing of the Locomotives on Highways Act 1896 involved considerable contingency. The reform movement had been building for years, but the final push to passage involved specific individuals, particular debates, and chance political circumstances that might easily have turned out differently. What if the parliamentary session had ended before the act could be passed? What if key supporters had been ill or distracted by other issues? What if opposition had been better organized? Any of these factors might have delayed reform, perhaps for years. This contingency should make us humble about our ability to predict or control technological and social change. We can identify trends and pressures, but specific outcomes often depend on unpredictable factors: individual decisions, chance encounters, timing, and luck. Walter Arnold couldn't have known he would become famous for receiving a speeding ticket. P.C. Russell couldn't have known his bicycle chase would be remembered a century later. The legislators who passed the 1896 Act couldn't have known they were enabling an industry that would come to dominate the global economy. They all just made decisions based on the information and understanding they had at the time. Some of those decisions proved consequential, others did not. But the pattern of consequence wasn't entirely predictable from the circumstances. This should make us thoughtful about our own time. The decisions we make today about emerging technologies, how to regulate artificial intelligence, how to manage the transition to electric vehicles, how to govern social media and digital platforms, will have consequences we can't fully foresee. Like the Victorians grappling with motor cars, we can identify general principles: protect public safety, enable beneficial innovation, manage disruption fairly, but we can't know exactly how our choices will play out. We can only do our best with imperfect information, knowing that future generations will judge us by standards and knowledge we don't yet possess. At a deeper level, the motor car represented something profound: the continuing conquest of distance that has characterized modernity. For most of human history, distance was a fundamental constraint on human activity. You couldn't easily live far from where you worked. Trade was limited by the cost and difficulty of transportation. News traveled slowly. Personal relationships were constrained by physical proximity. Each improvement in transportation technology has chipped away at this constraint. Better roads and vehicles allowed trade over longer distances. Canals reduced the cost of moving bulk goods. Railways made travel faster and cheaper than ever before. Telegraph conquered distance for information. Ocean steamships connected continents. The motor car represented another step in this ongoing process. It promised personal mobility, the ability to travel door to door without depending on fixed routes or schedules. In principle, someone with a motor car could go anywhere roads existed, whenever they wanted. This freedom would prove transformative. The motor car enabled suburbs, allowing people to live miles from where they worked. It transformed leisure, making weekend trips and tourism accessible to millions. It changed the geography of commerce, making locations without rail connections viable for business. It altered dating and courtship, giving young people mobility and privacy their parents never had. But in 1896, all of this was still potential rather than reality. Walter Arnold's 8-mile-per-hour drive through Paddock Wood was a tiny step toward a world where distance mattered less, where physical location imposed fewer constraints on human activity. The Victorian world, for all its railways and telegraphs, was still fundamentally place-bound. Most people lived and died within a few miles of where they were born. The motor car, along with later developments like trucks, buses and eventually aircraft, would help create a much more mobile society, with all the opportunities and challenges that mobility brings. Standing in Paddock Wood on that January morning, neither Arnold nor Russell could have imagined the world their confrontation foreshadowed. A world of morning commutes and traffic jams, of road trips and drive-through restaurants, of suburbs sprawling for miles beyond city centers, of global supply chains dependent on truck transport. But the seeds of that world were there in Arnold's Arnold-Benz, putting along at 8 miles per hour, promising freedom and mobility to those willing to embrace the new technology.